Thank you for coming. Please turn to 1 Corinthians 11 as we continue our discussion, the first part of 1 Corinthians chapter 11. 1 Corinthians, the book of 1 Corinthians is divided into sections according to the problems that they were facing, that Paul deals with. The section we're dealing with in chapters 11 through 14 deals with the problems that they had in their conduct in their assemblies, disorder and confusion and other problems, and we'll talk about as we continue. And we are summarizing the viewpoints, right, and different viewpoints from one way or the other, of the different explanations of the first section of chapter 11. Last week we covered the idea that the covering was just a social custom, and the one area left to discuss is whether or not women should wear a special covering today. So that's where we are at the beginning of our class today. Any questions or discussion anybody has as we begin? Comments do you have, especially on the idea of whether or not she should wear it today? Comments? All right, let me summarize then briefly reasons we've given. The idea is, we're talking about the special covering. There's the long hair, which is a covering she wears all the time, verse 15, but there's according to this view, then there's another covering which she can remove or put on, which she wears during the worship assemblies, in verses 5 through 7. And there's two main reasons that I suggest. The one is for believing that. One is the language. Verses 4 and 5, she's uncovered, she dishonors her head. Verse 6, it's shameful to be uncovered. And verses 7 and 10, she ought to have a symbol on her head. And the question, which I believe is a rhetorical question, is it proper? Verse 13. So the language implies that which is still expected by God. And the other reason, group of reasons really, is the principles in which the idea is based. And it's, first of all, based on the principle of headship, which is still in effect today. It's based on the shame of being shorn, the principle of image and glory, and then the rhetorical question in verse 13. So that's a summary of the reasons for believing that the woman should wear a special covering during the assemblies. Comments, discussion? So are we ready to conclude and draw some final conclusions? All right, let's look at some conclusions then. One of the things that we have said repeatedly, at least I have, is that I don't see 100% conclusion any of those viewpoints. I don't see any of them as 100% conclusive, including the one that I prefer. I don't see the conclusive evidence. So the question that I have for us to consider and to think about is, what do you do when you're dealing with a practice which you're not 100% conclusive? I would be surprised if there's very many in the room who do have a 100% conclusive view. You may prefer a certain view, but to think it's 100% conclusive, that you've proved it without question, I haven't for myself, and I'd be surprised if there are very many in the room who have. So what do you do when you're dealing with an issue that you have some evidence to consider, but you don't have 100% conclusive evidence one way or the other in your mind? What do you do? How do you handle it? See what I've got here. Yeah. Rick?
First thing is you don't judge.
Okay.
You don't judge another person for how they feel.
All right. So you're going to end up treating it as a matter of conscience, aren't you? You can't, if you can't prove it, you can't say if somebody else is in sin, they have a different view. All right. So that would make it what we would call a matter of Romans 14. It's not a matter that you can condemn other people for having a different view. What else? Well, what do you do for yourself? That's what you would do for other people. What do you do for yourself with this when you're not 100% sure? Sharon?
One thing you can keep doing is just keep coming back to it every once in a while to study it more and hope that you've grown more and we'll see more the next time you study it.
Okay. Study further later on. And that's true, I think, for many of us with many things. We know we don't have all the answers when we're first converted. So as we go along, we're going to grow in our knowledge. Okay? Frank?
Practice what you come nearest to understanding on the matter.
Okay, all right. I have a comment on that, but anybody else have a comment? Daryl?
Say in a situation like that, pray to God. Say, I don't fully understand this issue. I think maybe I understand it. And so I'm going to do what I think I understand, like Frank was saying. But be merciful to me if I've not understood well.
Okay. All right, well, here's a thought that I would like for you to think about. What I do in a situation like this is I look for it to see if there's a course that's safe. By that, a course which, if I take that course, I wouldn't be wrong. Even if it's not exactly what the scriptures say, Romans 14 talks about that kind of thing, where you satisfy your own conscience with what you believe is the least doubtful, because either way it goes, you're okay. So here, let me illustrate what I mean. As far as I can tell, God is not saying that it's wrong for a woman to wear the covering during the assembly, the special covering. He doesn't forbid it. The message is either saying that he requires it or that he doesn't view it as necessary one way or the other. He's not saying it's sinful. It would either be required or it would be a matter of personal conscience. So the alternatives, as far as I can see from God's viewpoint, is it's not necessary or it's required. Those are the alternatives to consider. Regarding the woman, she either wears it or she doesn't. So here's my concern. Suppose it turns out that it's not necessary. The woman wears it, she's okay, she's doing it, as long as she's not contentious. As long as she's not condemning other people, she wears it. She's not hurting, she's not violating God's law by wearing it. If the woman doesn't wear it, she's not violating God's law either. So either way is okay. Here's the problem that I have. What if it turns out, since I'm not 100% sure, what if it turns out that God does want it? Well, the woman who wears it's okay. What about the woman who doesn't wear it? And it turns out, though, that God wanted it, and she wasn't 100% sure. It turns out that the correct answer is God wanted it. What then? And frankly, that's where I end up on this. Yes, I acknowledge I can't 100% prove the view that I believe is most likely, but I believe there's a view, an approach that's safe. That women can do it and not have to worry about which way it goes. She's okay either way. So to me, it's a way that's right and cannot be wrong, and to me, I solve the problem that way. That's my conclusion. Other comments? Karen, this woman over here.
For me, it's not so much feeling safe as it is if I consider myself coming and not wearing it, then I think I've always had doubts about that. I would think maybe I should be wearing it. I probably should be wearing it. But so wearing it helps my conscience feel like I'm doing right according to the passage as I understand it.
Other comments? Yes, Grace.
Just say that taking the safe way. Like there's wisdom in that, but I know from personal experience it can be a really slippery slope when you start saying, well, if I don't know, I'll always do the thing that this way I can't be wrong, because I lived like that for a couple months, a couple years ago. I had a really bad problem with overthinking, and I was always worried that I was sinning somehow, and I was like, maybe I am, maybe I'm not, but what if I am? And I was so consumed by it that I had a hard time sleeping and eating. And I'm not saying it's wrong to take a safe way by I'm saying it does take some being careful with, because you can get, if you don't trust God's mercy, that if you're trying your best, He is willing to forgive what you like genuine mistakes, you can get into a bad place.
Okay, Sharon, was your hand up?
I was going to add, this also does not offset what you're saying, but it's another thing to factor in, which is kind of the theme of this whole study. But for myself, I can look at it and say, there's a safe way, one that for sure isn't sin. But another factor is our influence on other people. If wearing a veil has a somewhat high probability of making other Christian women doubt, it has a very high probability of turning away non-Christians. And they shouldn't be turned away by that, but they don't know yet. And if I knew that God absolutely, if I was sure, or even pretty sure, that God wanted me to do this, then it wouldn't matter what other people think at all. But if I'm not really sure that at all that the passage says that, I do feel like that is something to consider. That I might be doing something that makes it hard for other people to come to Christ, that they might look at me and be like, oh look, Mormon people or something like that. Not Mormon, sorry. Mennonite people or Amish people, or and that it has a stigma. And if it affects the way other people think about Christ, when I'm doing something that I'm really not sure I'm required to do, for me that is something else to factor in.
Okay. Well, I would have a response to that. I don't know what the rest of your experience has been. If the woman's not contentious, we're still back to that point, a very important point, that she's not condemning other people. She's just satisfying her own conscience. I have to say, in 75 years, 75 years, attending the Lord's church, and all this time I've known women who wear a covering, I don't know of a single case of a non-Christian being turned away by it. I've had some ask questions. I was preaching the gospel full time for 40 years. It was never an issue with anybody that I was ever trying to teach that I know of. So to say there's a very high probability, I have to disagree with that, I think. But it's something to think about, but it's not, to me, an issue that some think it might be. All right. Is that it? We done? Have we, shall I say, covered the issue? Okay. All right, so we move on now to the next section. Yes.
I didn't realize you were actually really done.
I'm done.
I just wanted to comment that I appreciate the congregation here. I appreciate everywhere we've been. Everywhere we've ever been. There's always been respect for each other on whether you wore it or not. It's never been an issue anywhere we've ever been. So I am very appreciative of that. I think that's the way it should be. It's a blessing.
Well, and I would like to add that I appreciate the class in your approach. That you've been cooperative, and everybody's been very willing to think and talk politely towards one another, as Christians should, and I appreciate that. Thank you. Okay? So moving on then. Let's just read verse 17 through 22. Who'd like to read chapter 11, verse 17 through 22? Bill, 11, 17 through 22.
Now, in giving him instructions, I do not praise you, since you come together not for the better, but for the worse. For first of all, when you have come together as a church, I hear that there are divisions among you, and in part I believe it. For there must also be factions among you, that those who are approved may be recognized among you. Therefore, when you come together in one place, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper, for in eating each one takes his own supper ahead of others, and one is hungry and the other is drunk.
Okay. Oops, sorry, one more verse.
What do you not have houses to eat and drink in? Or do you despise the church of God and shame those who have nothing? But shall I say to you, shall I praise you in this? I do not praise you.
Okay. So to go back to our questions, oh, by the way, I do have a handout for you at the end on the covering, so I wasn't quite done. But going back now to the questions. What's the topic? Question number 27. What's the topic we're going to be discussing in this next section? Steve.
Talk about abuses and misunderstandings surrounding the Lord's Supper.
Okay. Problems in the assembly continuing, problems in the Lord's Supper. Okay. So, verse 17, we've discussed some already with regard to the previous discussion. We have what I believe is a transition verse. These instructions, I believe, refers back to the previous discussion, leading into the next discussion, because in both areas there were problems in there when they came together. I might add, I guess it wasn't quite done, was it? I might add that there's someone's reference to the ESV saying following in teaching. The word, there's no word for following in the ESV. In the original, there's no word for following. You might want to remember that. So, verse 18 then, he begins discussing the topic of the rest of the chapter. And what is he saying about it? Question 28. What's he saying about it? Verse 28, what is he saying, or 18, what is he saying about the new issue? Verse 18.
Divisions.
There's divisions. There is strife that he's heard in the church. And notice he's talking about their assembly and things that happen in their assembly. Okay, and we'll talk at great length as we go through this discussion then about the things that happen. Okay? So then we get to question number 19. He says that there are heresies in the King James. So I ask you, what is heresy talking about? Neil.
It sounds like as he's observing them, he can see that some favor others. They're not all treating each other the same. They esteem some over other members.
Okay, that's certainly one of the problems, was that they didn't treat one another with respect. Okay, the discussion on the word heresy. Terry.
It's generally a false doctrine or a belief that contradicts the core belief of Christians who follow God's will.
Okay.
And it leads to division.
Okay. All right. Other comments on the word heresy? Sure.
Most translations say factions, which takes us back to the first few chapters of the book where they were divided into groups or sects over all different things. There's something else that they divide up into groups over.
Okay. So heresy is factions, division. So it's another word for the problem they discussed or introduced in verse 18, that there's divisions among you. There must be factions. Why? What reason does he give why there? We would think that there shouldn't be factions, and I don't think he's saying there should be, but why does he say there would, you would expect it to be in the last part of 19? Susie.
To manifest those who are, lost my word.
Out of line for lack.
Thank you.
Okay.
To make manifest manifest those who are being divisive and those who are holding to the true doctrine.
Okay. So obviously, Scripture speaks frequently against division and against doctrines, heresy, doctrines that cause division, but there is something good that can come from it that helps you to recognize those who really don't have the right attitude towards God in the first place and towards his other people. It becomes obvious when you face troublesome situations like they're facing in Corinth. It separates people from one from another based on their proper attitudes towards one another and towards God. I'll comment on 19. Susie.
In 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 3, Paul told them or rebuked them because they were still babes, and because of that they were still carnal, and which led to envy, strife, and division. So they haven't grown and matured in the word. So they're still acting childish.
And we're going to see as we go through this section and on through the next few chapters, I think will help us understand the problem in Corinth. Corinth was a very immature group of many of them relatively new converts, struggling, seriously struggling with attitude problems towards one another, and especially we're going to see in the assemblies as we go through the chapter, and hopefully we'll begin to put it together, a better understanding of what was going on. Other comments on verse 19. Okay. And the next question then. 30. When and where did these problems occur? When were they having these problems? Where were they having these problems? Karen?
When you come together in one place.
When you come together in one place. Now that will be further defined in chapter 14. So he's talking about the church, the whole church being assembled together. And I believe that helps us understand some things about the Lord's Supper, that the Lord wants it in the assembly. This is not a private activity. In contrast to, we'll see, a common meal for nourishment. That is outside the assembly, but the Lord's Supper is in the assembly. And there's different rules for inside versus outside. Okay? Other comments on question number 30? Terry?
You asked the question when, and the only answer to that comes in Acts 20 and 7 on the Lord's Day, when they came together to break bread, indicates when that occurred.
Okay. Which brings up another question, which I think is significant. From chapter 11 here, what do we know about how often or when these assemblies occur? From chapter 11, what do we know about how often these things occur? Susie?
Yeah.
We don't. I think that's a significant point because some misunderstand that. That doesn't mean we don't know. We know because of Acts 20 verse 7, but we know because of other passages. Paul is saying, when you assemble together, do this, don't do that. That doesn't tell you when to do it. Later on in chapter 14, he's going to say, when you assemble, do this, and don't do that regarding spiritual gifts. In Matthew chapter 6, he said, when you do charitable deeds, do this. When you pray, do this. It doesn't tell you how often to pray or how often to do charitable deeds. It's just, whenever you do it, do this. That's what we're having here. So when he says in the assembly, in verse 18, when you come together as a church, he's not defining when we do it. He's just explaining, here's what to do whenever that happens. Other passages have to tell us when we're supposed to do it. Okay? Anything else to last part of 20. First part says when you come together in one place. What does he mean it is not to eat the Lord's Supper, last part of 20? What does he mean by that? It's not to eat the Lord's Supper. I thought it was to eat the Lord's Supper. What does he mean when he says it's not to eat the Lord's Supper? Sharon.
They would say it is, but the Lord's Supper is supposed to be a communion, according to chapter 10, a sharing. And if they're doing it, if they're doing it at different times, if they're treating it like a common meal, then that's not actually what they're doing at all.
Okay. So they would no doubt disagree with this statement that it's not to eat the Lord's Supper. They probably thought they were. He's saying what you do isn't the Lord's Supper. You're coming together and you're doing it. You think you do that, but that's really what you're doing. It's not really the Lord's Supper. You've got it so messed up, it's not the Lord's Supper anymore. Okay? Other comments through 20. Okay. Anything else through 20? Anybody? Terry?
The question in verse 18.
Okay.
Why Paul says, I partly believe it.
Okay. Comments back on verse 18. Why Paul says, I hear the divisions and in part I believe it. Comments on that? Rick?
It's just like the verses brought up earlier, plus chapter 5 and verse 1, about sins going on in the church, and people were still allowing these people to remain there. There was many divisions in the church of Corinth.
Okay.
We're learning everything.
Okay. Other comments? In part I believe it, or partially I believe it. The only thing I take out of it is it's just not, he's not there. He's going what people have told him. So maybe he's not convinced it's as bad as what he's heard. He's not sure. That's all I got out of it. I don't know. But he knows it's bad, but maybe not as bad as what he's heard. I think he's trying to give him a little bit of the benefit of the doubt maybe with that. Okay, other comments? Okay. Question number 31. We already did verse 22. 32, and we get into question, well, now let's look at 21. I think 21 is important for us to understand the problem. So let's look at 21 more closely. See where I am in my notes here. Okay. According to verse 21, what is the problem that he's discussing? I think I really meant in the verse, question number 31, I think I meant verse 21. What's the problem according to verse 21? Rick?
The way they were doing things when they come together, they were treating everything as common, not as worshiping God, but they was more worried about eating and drinking than what they were actually praising God.
Okay. So one thing he says, one is hungry and another is drunk, which implies they're making a feast. It's a meal. It's not just a memorial. It's a meal. Okay? Other comments on what the problem was? Frank?
They were, it seems that there were some who were poor that had nothing to eat, or they didn't bring anything to eat because maybe they thought this is supposed to be a memorial of the Lord's Supper, so they didn't bring a common meal with them.
Okay, verse 22 says they shame those who have nothing. So apparently there were some who didn't have a big meal to bring with them. And the other people who did have, wealthier people, had a big spread, didn't care about those who didn't have anything. They just went ahead and ate their own meal anyway. Other comments on what the problem was. I really think it's important for us to understand the problem in order to understand the solution better. Terry?
Well, this was not being done in fellowship one with the other with the Lord. They were doing it independently of each other, without thought of the other person. So it wasn't a spiritual thing that they were doing. It was physical, but they weren't doing it together.
Okay. The word together becomes significant in what we're talking about, I think. He says that, well, let me give you some translations of the first part of 21. New King James says, in your reading, each one takes his own supper ahead of others. The King James American Standard, everyone taketh before other his own supper. New American Standard, each one takes his own supper first. ESV, each one goes ahead with his own meal. Lexham English Bible, each one of you goes ahead to take his own supper. Modern English Version, each one eats his own supper ahead of others. And I could go on. The point of the problems I see is people didn't care what other people were doing or wanted to do. They basically said, I'm ready for my meal, I'm going to eat. Maybe other people over here doing something else. Maybe over here they're praying. I'm hungry, I'm going to eat. Maybe somebody wants to sing. I'm hungry, I'm going to eat. So there was a complete disrespect for the needs of other people, spiritually and physically. And back to Terry's point, there was such disorder, such confusion, because you've got different people doing different things at the same time. Rather than everybody focusing on the Lord's Supper, at the time of the Lord's Supper, everybody focusing on the singing, and we'll see, this brings us into chapter 14, we'll see more about it in chapter 14. A similar kind of thing. Instead of, when it was time to sing, instead of everybody singing, some would sing and some would pray and some would do other things. So you had disorder and confusion where it became virtually impossible to do any of the acts that were supposed to be done in the assemblies. Okay? So to me, it's important because it helps us explain this as a solution to it. And helps us understand chapter 14, their assemblies were a mess. They just were not spiritual. They were turning it into something physical, satisfying themselves and disregarding one another and doing things out of complete disorder so that there were not togetherness in that sense, where the group is doing things together. As they did each act, they should be doing it together. Instead, different people doing different things. I think that's 21's saying that, and some of the solutions he gives are going to emphasize that. Comments? Comment.
Questions in my mind here. Back to a basic thought here. Is he condemning people bringing meals into the worship service, or is it that that was a common thing that people had to bring their meals and had nothing to do with when they were doing the communion? What are we talking about, a basic problem here? Because later he says, can't you eat at home? So is he talking about big meals that are brought into the worship assembly?
Okay, comments? The fact that it says, comment?
That's a good question. It seems to, I'm not certain about this, but it seems to me that the custom in Corinth, and maybe widely elsewhere, was that you would bring your own bread and the drink. And the problem in Corinth was that some had turned it into more than simply some bread and the cup. And on top of that, didn't care about the fact that some had nothing, so they hadn't brought anything because they didn't have anything, and no concern about sharing what they had brought. It seems to me, yeah, they brought the elements with them.
Rather than making some arrangements so that everybody had what they needed. To me, it helps to go back to talk about what we did in discussing the eating of meats back in chapter 10. You have to understand these people came from a Gentile idol-worshiping background. That's where most of them came from. It's stated more than once in the letter. And they were used to, when they worshiped their idols, make a big feast out of it. They'd bring food, they'd bring meat, they'd bring drinks, wine, and alcoholic beverages, and have a big banquet, big to-do. And that was their way of worshiping their God. And it seems to me like that's carried over. Not because Paul taught them that, but because, like in many other ways, they're going back to their old habits, which they enjoyed, which they liked. And so they're trying to do the same kind of thing here, and they've messed up the Lord's Supper in the process. That thought seems to me to carry through. Other comments? Okay. Let's summarize what we've learned to this point. 22 relates to it. Don't you have house to eat and drink in? But it's almost time for class to be over. So I want to summarize the problems that we see at this point in the church. First of all, they turned the Lord's Supper into a common meal. They satisfied their selfish desires. Instead of loving and respecting other people, they're just satisfying themselves. They disregarded whether others had the opportunity to participate or not. I don't care whether they can participate, I want to eat. And they're disorderly, participating in different acts at the same time. Those seem to me to be the problems that they had. And if we understand the problems, it's going to help us to understand the solutions that Paul gives in the following verses. Other comments on the problem as it existed in the congregation? Okay. Susie.
I just have it's just a thought. That's a big leap of celebrating that from here's my body and here's my blood, unleavened bread and fruit of the vine. That's a big leap.
Okay. Which brings me to, Velma, go ahead.
Well, my question was, I was wondering, is he condemning them making this a big meal and not just the communion that they're supposed to be doing?
Well, again, you come back to the solution was, if any man is hungry, let him eat at home. Look at where denominations are today. They've got the scriptures, they've got the completed scriptures. And yet, much of what they do has nothing to do with saving souls, or spreading the gospel, or helping people serve God. They got involved in all kinds of activities other than that. Fun and games and parties and banquets and, yes, and sports. And you'd think it was a big social club. So, yes, we could look at this and say, wow, that doesn't sound right at all. And it wasn't. But so many religious groups today are also far, far, far away from what God says in His Word that the church should be and should do. Once you start down that road, it just keeps going and going and going. Okay, let's take our break there, and we'll take up in verse 22 next time and continue. Thank you.